So to start off, I'm Tom Schlick. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm a software engineer or former software engineer at a company called Run My Business. We're a commercial real estate software consultancy. I've been an attendee of every US Laracon. I'm a creator of a service called Zone Watcher, which is like a DNS watching service, changelog service. And you can follow me on Twitter at Tom Schlick. So what we're going to cover today, first of all, what is multi-tenancy? Why would you need it? The single versus multi-database setup. How you segment things like a job queue, console commands, search, caches, things like that. How to deal with external services. And examples for getting started with multi-tenancy and some popular packages for different types of multi-tenancy. So the first, what is multi-tenancy? The majority of you know, but for those who don't, multi-tenancy is a single instance of software that serves multiple customers privately. So we think of it as you can log into a service, see your data, somebody else can log into the same service, see their data, and you're not mixing that data between them unless you explicitly want to. Some examples of multi-tenant apps you would already use. Things like Forge, Envoy, or Spark, some bigger names like Slack and Stripe and even Google. Those can all be considered multi-tenant apps because your data is siloed and private. So why would you even want to use multi-tenancy? Well, the first one would be some types of, it would be cost savings. So all your customers can be hosted on the same servers, which means you can spend less on servers. Second would be a single deployment point. So because they're on your servers, they're not on your customer servers or separate servers that you're hosting per customer. It's easy to deploy, and I'm sure many of you have done that in the past. The third would be easier maintenance. So because they're your servers, you can take them out of a pool. You don't have to worry about having multiple servers for each customer to maintain high availability. You can just do that all in one system of servers that you maintain. So this is kind of where the talk gets a little bit more technical. You know, how do you structure your database for these multi-tenant apps? There's many ways to go about it, and none of them are really wrong, but some can be wrong for your approach, your application. There's always those small details that I won't know. Then you basically have to make the decision for yourself. So hopefully this talk will give you some insight onto what those questions you should be asking are, and help you decide for your own applications. So the first one we're going to cover is the simplest. It's the single database approach. So I'm sure most of you who have written multi-tenant apps before have used this approach. Basically, all of your customers are stored in the same database, and you have some sort of tenant ID on each table to differentiate between those two. So if you wanted to set this up, how would you do so for the people who haven't set it up before? The easiest way to go about it is you add where clauses to all of your queries. But obviously, that can get pretty tedious. And if you miss some, you're opening yourself up to basically displaying one customer's data for another, which obviously isn't good. So wouldn't it be awesome if we could just show this, for instance, and have Laravel handle the back end of it? Well, we are kind of in luck because Laravel has query scopes, which make it super easy to do that. So on the left here, you can see I've created a tenant scope, and that automatically applies a where clause on any query that's run for any model that we apply this scope to. So if I run that users all, it's going to say where tenant ID equals 3, or whatever that is. It also will do it for relations and anything else that Eloquent is touching. This will not work for handwritten queries or anything like that, so that's something to be aware of. So this is actually how you would apply that to a model. So basically, you would override the boot function on that model and add a global scope. So you can see add global scope, new tenant scope. And by doing that, basically it will do what we just talked about. It will apply that scope to every instance of any query you do for that model. So we're going to get into some pros and cons of these different approaches. So the first is this is a very conventional approach. It's the most common. If you've written a multi-tenant app, most likely, I'd say probably 95% of the people who've written a multi-tenant app will use this approach the first time at least. So there's a lot of existing knowledge and a lot of existing articles on how to go about that. The second is your migrations stay simple. This is something we're going to talk about a little later in the talk when we get to the multi-database approach. But your migrations stay basically like it's a single Laravel application. You're not crossing databases. You're not dealing with multiple clients and changing that. So your migrations stay simple. And the third and almost one of the most important pieces is it's easy to display data from multiple tenants on the same page if you need to. Now this is kind of one of those core questions that we'll get to later, but if you need to display multiple clients on the same page, you're most likely going to want to go with a single database approach. So the cons. Although we have query scopes, that's still a con that you need to apply that or a where clause to every database query. Eventually you're going to miss one, and you risk basically displaying customer A's data to customer B, which obviously isn't good. And depending on the sensitivity of the data or the industry you're in, that could hurt your reputation or even bring potential lawsuits on your company because you displayed sensitive information. The second is using third-party packages often becomes difficult because say you're bringing in an activity feed package. That activity feed package that stores data in the database doesn't have that tenant ID column in its database. So you need to modify both the models and the migrations, which becomes cumbersome if you need to follow or if you need to update those packages, making sure they're not breaking anything you've modified, things like that. The last is the second to last. It's hard to scale that database once you kind of reach the upper limit. So once you have, for instance, if you are featured on Hacker News and you get millions of users or even hundreds of thousands of users and your data explodes and you need to expand that database, once you hit the upper limit of database server sizes, you hit a lot of problems with your indexes and everything else. So you want to be able to spread that across multiple servers, and it makes it difficult when everybody's in the same database to do that. And the fourth is it's very painful to export a customer and their data. So you could see a situation where a customer comes to you and says, hey, I want to move off of your service to another one, or we need all of our data for some regulatory type thing where they need to review it. It's difficult to go through every one of your tables and write a query basically to pull all of that out, plus all of its relations, and tie it all together in a nice way. So that's something to consider. If you need to do that, maybe another approach would be best. All right, so the next strategy, and personally my favorite, is the multi-database approach. So how would you go about doing this? Basically, it's basically each tenant of your application has their own database. And it's basically a full copy of your Laravel application, removing a few things that we'll talk about in a bit. But so they have, they all have a users table, they all have a migrations table, they all have, if you had properties in your system, for instance, they would all have a properties table, and it's just their data. So if you wanted to start setting this up, how would you go about doing that? You would actually have another database that we call the shared database. And this kind of acts as a router. So when a request comes in, you identify the subdomain of the request if you were using the subdomain type style of domains. And you would say, OK, I want to connect to Initech, which is number 2. And basically, you would set Laravel up so that the database would then change on the fly in the background. And I'll talk about that next. So on the left side, you can see I have 2 different connections in Laravel. They're collapsed, but the first one would be the shared, which you would have all of your information filled out by default. And the second would actually be kind of empty. And what you do is in a service provider, you basically do what I was talking about. You find what domain, the domain name that's coming in, and basically you can generate your database name based on that because you find the tenant. So you say I want to connect to tenant ID or tenant_1, that's the database name. And on the right-hand side in that service provider, you can actually set that via the config. So you would say, database.connections, tenant database, and you're going to pass it the database name. Next, you're going to set that as the default connection. Basically, what that does is there's a connection variable on your models. So you can set that. By default, it is, I think, just MySQL. But you can set that to whatever you want. So you would set that as shared or tenant on the left side. But setting it as the default makes it so you don't have to set that property for the majority of your models. You would just have to set it for that tenant model. Next, we are setting as the current tenant. That's just something that I do to basically store it statically. Then you would reconnect the tenant database. And the reason you wouldn't just call connect is there's a few things that Laravel needs to clean up. There's some caches. So calling reconnect actually clears those caches and sets everything correctly. After that, you would set your app name, app URL, basically any other config variable that you'd want to set per tenant. And I'm also firing some events there, which are very helpful as well. So a pro of this approach is you have reduced points of failure. There's a single point in your application where you're actually doing that segmentation, where you're switching that database. Instead of having where clauses all over your application, or scopes all over the application that you might not think about adding. After this point, after the service provider, there's no place in the application where that happens. To Laravel, it's a single database application. It doesn't really care at that point. So there's less of a chance of one customer's data being exposed to another, which is huge if you're in the enterprise or some type of regulated industry where that would be catastrophic to your business. The second pro is you can use third-party packages off the shelf. You don't have to make those modifications to them, and basically when changes are released, you don't have to lock down your composer files so tightly that you have to review every change. Because if somebody, even if they make a bug fix, but they're relying on something that, they're relying on their code, but you change that code, you can run into a lot of issues where, some innocuous change that you think isn't going to hurt anything completely breaks your application. The next would be easier long-term scalability. So your customers' databases can be easily transitioned between database servers depending on the size of the database, the load, or any type of failures. So instead of scaling vertically by just creating giant database servers, you would scale horizontally by just creating more database servers. So for instance, instead of having 1,000 customers on one database server, you could have 100 customers on 10 database servers. And that provides you some, that reduces your point of failures over time, because, you could always have a slave database, but if something goes wrong with, a database server getting deleted entirely, you're still going to bring down all of your clients. But if it happened in this case, you would bring down 10% of your clients until you got that fixed. So the next pro would be data portability. It's along the same lines where it's easier to export without those complex separation steps. Backups can be done separately per tenant, making them easier to restore. So from my experience, the majority of database restores have happened because a single client has deleted a bunch of things they shouldn't, or something like that. So this makes it super easy to just say, okay, tenant 20 just deleted 20 of their users, which they needed. So we need to restore that. So if you had to do that in a single database environment, you'd have to basically roll back database logs or something like that, which can get you into the weeds. It's not very fun. The next is enterprise customers can be transitioned to on-premise setups pretty easily. So if you think of something like GitHub Enterprise, or I know Slack has a version of it, where they can take their data that they were using in the software as a service application and transition it to behind their firewall, either for regulatory or compliance. There's all kinds of restrictions on why companies can't use software as a service products. With this, they would be able to. So if they started with your application and then they got big enough that they wanted to host it themselves, you could do that. Obviously, you'd still need access to update it and everything like that. But This would allow you to basically do a SQL dump, take their database, and put it directly into a custom server for them, and it would just work. The next is that tenant data can easily be deleted at the request of an owner. So along the same lines of exporting, you'd have to write this giant script to loop through all of your models, all of your tables, and basically find all of that tenant data and its relations to delete it, which can be pretty cumbersome if you have a lot of models and tables. So with this, you would basically just do a MySQL drop database, and it would just be gone. So it makes it a lot easier to do that. The next pro would be the ability to cluster your customers together. So you can think of it as you might create groups of customers, and they're on their own kind of instances of the application. So you might have kind of an enterprise tier where you have customers that are very important on 5 times redundant servers and things like that. And then you have kind of other customers. So that makes it easier to do that because you can move these databases back and forth. You don't have to worry about how would I get that data in and out of the application. You can also choose where a customer's data is stored based on their location for latency, or even, I know there's, in the EU, there's a data privacy law that is either going into effect or being talked about where EU data has to be stored in the EU. So if you're a US-based company, you might want to have an EU data center that hosts all your EU customers and a US data center that hosts all your US customers to basically for latency purposes and for those compliance reasons. And you can also add customers to, for instance, a beta cluster. So if you have customers that want a new feature before others, you could transition them to a different cluster, upgrade that cluster, and they would get access before the others. So you could write all kinds of scripts around this to move customers back and forth, and they wouldn't be any the wiser. They wouldn't see anything happen because it's just a seamless transition. So now we're getting to the cons, some of the trade-offs of using a multiple database setup. The first is migrations will take you longer. Not much longer, usually a few seconds per database or per deployment, but it is longer. So you have to run through them all independently. So you can see on the left there on the screenshots, I've written a custom command to run through migrations in sequence, one after the other. So you see it happen one and then the next one. So if you have a long migration that's taking a long time per database, you might want to consider putting that in the background or doing it in parallel somehow so that you're not hanging up your deployments. The second is that you have 2 sets of migrations. So you can see on the right you have your shared database migrations, which hold your tenant table and anything else that you want to hold centrally in your application. And then you have each tenant migration, and that also comes with factories and seeds and everything else related to databases. So how do you choose the correct strategy? I mean, what are those questions you need to ask yourself? So I've came up with 4 here that I think are fairly relevant. The first one is, do you commonly need to display information from multiple tenants on the same page? If so, I would go with the single database strategy because you don't want to create hundreds of database connections to aggregate all of that data. The second would be, do you need the option to segment, export, or privately host data for your particular customers? If that's the case, then multiple databases is probably your answer because that's going to be a lot harder with a single database approach. Some extra ones are, if you plan to use a lot of third-party packages, I would basically tell you to go with the multiple database, but that's also something that's not concrete because we're not adding packages every day. But we might be updating them, several times a week. So that's something to consider if you're, again, going for the single database approach, that you need to watch for those types of breaking changes. And the fourth is, are your customers providing highly sensitive data to your application? I know in the industry that I worked in, the commercial real estate industry, our customers were putting financial documents and customer names and all kinds of things in there for $100 million properties. So if that got exposed or shared to the wrong person, we definitely would have been looking at a lawsuit on our hands. So now we're going to get to the data segmentation. Not the database side, but all those extra services. So things like cache and the queues and search and everything else. So the first one's queued jobs. So in a multi-database approach, you'll want to pass some type of identifier along with your queued jobs. So when a job boots up, it needs to know which database to connect to because it doesn't have access to that request data unless you pass it to it. So I found the best way to do this is to basically create a trait that I add to my jobs. So basically, I override the serializes models, and I'll show you why further on. But I also add this method I just called useTenant. So when I'm actually creating a job, I say, job on this queue, use this tenant for this job. And the tenant method there is just a helper function that grabs the current tenant from the application. So you can see how easy that would be just to pass into a job. Now, what does Laravel do to actually bootstrap that? What do we have to hook into to pass that along and start the application on every job that it queues? Because you could have jobs side by side in the queue that are using different tenants. So you need to basically refresh that on every job. So Laravel, sorry if that's harder to read. Laravel basically uses what's called a wake-up method. And I believe this is part of the unserialized step in just PHP. But if not, it's part of what Laravel is using. And basically, we're overriding that. So we're saying when the wake-up method's called, we're calling restore tenant connection. And on the right side, you can see that method. Basically, we're looping through the properties there, finding the one that's tenant, and calling a connect tenant method, which does exactly the same as the previous, or the slide a few back did, where it actually sets all those variables, all that config, clears the cache for the database settings, and proceeds. And then basically, we proceed on with what Laravel basically uses for the wake-up method by default. So this handles all of the rehydration steps. And once all that's set, your application just knows where that database is. It knows which database to connect all those models to because you set that connection property on your models. So the next thing we want to talk about is console commands. So in a multi-tenant app, no matter which strategy you're using, I would recommend your console commands can do two things. Either run that command on everything or be able to selectively run it on a single tenant. So you could think of, for instance, like a cleanup script or something like that you might want to run on one customer but not all, or something like migrations where you run it on everybody across the board as you deploy. So these are custom commands, and we'll get to that in the next slide, but basically you can apply an all flag or you can apply the actual tenant identifier and it will find it and run through it. So how would we actually create one of those commands? So the best way I found is actually creating a base class that I extend all of my tenant commands from, or tenantable, anything that needs to switch between databases or switch between tenants. And basically what we end up doing in there is overriding the handle function. So that base command will take that handle function and basically start looping through all of the tenants that you provided, either by that all flag or by the tenant identifier. So it's setting that same tenant configuration every time it runs, and it's calling a handle tenant method. So if we go to the next slide, we will see how we might do that for the instance in the migrate. So it's being passed in. It gives you the tenant. In this case, we're not using it, but it's very helpful to have that in case you need to run something against the tenant database, so you have which tenant it is. And so I'm setting up the options there. So, but you can see with the multiple migrations, we also have to specify the path. So that's something to be aware of. And then we're just calling the default artisan command. So that process works exactly the same. It just kind of loops and goes over and over. So basically, this is handling a single tenant, and then it loops and goes to the next tenant and the next tenant, and just keeps calling that with each passed in. So the next thing I want to talk about is file and asset storage. So if you're running a single database, you might think, oh, I'll just throw everything in one bucket. It doesn't really matter. But I would actually, I would recommend segmenting those files in some type of folder with a tenant ID. And the reason that is It makes it easy to back up those files, remove them, delete them, whatever you need to do. If a client says, I want to take all of my data with me, you have to give them their files as well. And writing scripts to pull all that out and then store it in a logical way is more cumbersome than just being able to grab a whole directory and export that. So I would highly recommend doing it that way. I've run into it before, and it's not fun to write that script. So the next thing would be search. So I would recommend creating, again, for no matter which approach you use, creating separate search indexes for each of your tenant. Basically, the reason is, is that you're basically making your search index work harder every time you run a query, because they then have to remove, everybody that's not that tenant. But if you connect them directly to their own index, they just do whatever they need to do for the rest of the query. You don't have to worry about that part. So it's a little bit of optimization, but it could help you in the long run if your databases or if your search indexes get massive. So Laravel Scout actually makes this super simple. It actually allows you to provide a prefix key in the config. And you can set that in the service provider like we were talking about, or set it via one of the events when it's called. So basically, you would basically just set, I believe it's scout.prefix, and set that with your tenant ID, and basically it would prefix that on every search index and handle that automatically for you. The same actually goes for cache. So there's a prefix as well. So you definitely want to set that to avoid collisions. It would be pretty disastrous if you were caching, for instance, user ID 10, but every instance of every tenant had a user ID 10. And if you didn't have a prefix there, you're going to run into collisions and serving up data. And you probably won't figure out why for a little bit until you realize it's the cache, which isn't a fun day. So that can also be done very easily via the cache config. I believe that has a prefix as well. So you can set that in your service provider, and you're good to go. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is external services. So what do I mean by external services? I mean services that you're connecting to and either putting data in or retrieving data from often. So think of it like services like Mailgun or any API that you'd be using. So you want to provide those with your tenant ID. Whether or not you're using the single or multiple database setup, you want to provide those with your tenant ID so that you can easily pull that out, or if you're running an application against that API, you can easily figure out which records are on which tenant without querying your database, which will lead to a lot of optimization in your setup. So I would highly recommend that. And it's especially important when dealing with webhooks. I know myself, some of our clients send upwards of 100,000 emails at a time, and we get a ton of webhooks from Mailgun. Putting that in there allows us to route that directly to that tenant for events and for like click and open tracking. So it makes it a lot easier to just put it directly in their database without having to verify or look up where users are in the system, what tenant they're for. We can just shove it right where we need to put it. So the next thing we're going to talk about is domain strategies. I think a lot of times these are overlooked as the simple problems, but if you don't get this right from the beginning, you'll run into some problems. So what do I mean by domain strategies is how you set up your actual domain. So for instance, acme.yourapp.com, where Acme is the customer name, the name they're choosing. So the benefit of this first one I call the subdomain approach. So the benefits of this is it works with both single and multi-tenant apps, and it provides custom branding to your customers, which a lot of customers will want. That's probably one of the most requested features when you don't have it this way, is they want some way to brand it themselves. It allows your customers to be logged into multiple accounts at the same time, basically multiple subdomains, because they have their own cookies. So you don't have to worry about writing something custom under the hood, which isn't fun. And it also allows you to use DNS to actually choose which servers handle which customers. So getting back to that clusters standpoint, if you had US and EU clusters, you want to send that traffic to it's the best place to handle that. You don't want to have to bounce it all over and deal with that setup. So what would be the cons of a subdomain setup? First is it requires a wildcard SSL certificate, which can be a few $100s. Now I know Let's Encrypt will be offering them early 2018, but until that point you would have to buy your own SSL certificate. The second is your API generally has to live on the same domain, which can make traffic funneling a little bit more difficult. Basically, you would have to reverse proxy it and then send it to different servers if you wanted to have a specific API servers. The next is that customers going to just the plain yourapp.com directly wouldn't be able to directly log into your application. They would have to get redirected to their own subdomain. So if you've used Slack before, you've seen this where they ask you for your team name. And what they're doing at that point is then just redirecting you to the teamname.slack.com to actually log in. So the next approach would be kind of the custom domain. So I know in the enterprise this is very, very popular, where they want to host everything on their actual domain. So yourapp.acme.com. So this works best with the multiple database setups, multiple database approaches. And the biggest pro is that your customer gets to white label their domain, which is huge for them, but it comes with some trade-offs as well. The first would be that your Nginx setup becomes way more complicated. You have to start serving multiple domains, multiple SSL certificates. You can use, for instance, Caddy to kind of reverse proxy this and send it through, but it still adds a lot of complexity to your application. And the second is your customer controls that DNS, which limits your ability to make changes, IP address changes, or taking servers out of rotation, things like that. It limits your ability. So you would have to have access to that or have some agreement with them where you give them 2 weeks notice and they change those IP addresses or something. And the last approach for domains is probably the most common, which is just hosting it directly on a single domain, no subdomains. And this works best for single database setups. It's nice because all of your customers know where to log in. They don't have to go to a subdomain. They don't have to know their team name. The API can live on a subdomain, so api.yourapp.com. And you don't have to deal with traffic funneling and everything like that. You can just use DNS to point that to a different server. And it's the easiest just because it's the most common. There's 1,000 articles on how to set that up. So if you're going with a single database approach, that might be the way you want to go. So for some examples would be Forge and Envoy use this approach. So the next, for the cons on that, you can't really log into multiple accounts. If any of you had tried using the multiple accounts feature of Google, it's not fun. Switching between accounts and having to switch back, and you get logged out of one and have to log into the other. It's not fun to use. And the second is there's no real way to specify which server in your application gets the traffic for a specific customer. So again, to the clustering point, it's not easy to do with that type of setup. So last thing is packages. So for the single database approach, I found this one called Landlord, which seems to be written correctly, and it seems to work pretty well. For the multi-database approach, I've started my own. I'm calling Townhouse, based on some of the code I've written over the past 5 or 6 years doing this kind of thing. And there's also one called Tenati, which handles, which has been around for a while and handles things pretty nicely as well. So that's it. If anybody has questions, I think I have a few minutes. So any questions? Yep. Yeah, so some approaches, so the question is, with the multi-database approach, how do you set up those databases? How do you provision them when a user is signing up? So generally that's pretty quick because you're running migrations and things. You can create a database, I think it's like 0.01 seconds to create a database. But if you wanted to, you could pre-provision those, and basically you just know which tenants aren't provisioned or haven't been assigned. So you would basically, you might provision 100 and keep that at 100. That way, if you get an influx of users, you could just throw them into those. So that definitely helps. But yeah, I mean, if you have a lot of migrations or something like that, and you want to do it on the fly, you might look into kind of caching all your migrations in a SQL file so that runs super quick.
And subscription part, the paying,
Right.
you would put on the shared data?
Yes, I would put all the billing in the shared, or all the billing and subscription data on the shared database. One of the reasons is obviously so you can keep it in one place and run reports, but the other is you don't want that data going with the tenant if they take their data. So, any others?
You showed two approaches, single database and multiple database. There is technically the third one in between, right? Single database, multiple schemas.
Right.
Databases like Postgres. Have you ever tried that?
I haven't gotten into it too much just because I've read a lot about how it's like kind of the Wild West. You end up running into a lot of issues with that. So I haven't done it myself, but I know it exists. Yeah, so. Any others? Yep.
So say you have many customers with very small amounts of data. Do you think that, say you only need a single database server, but you have 20, 30, 100,000 customers, is that an issue?
From what I've read, that's not that big of an issue. I think the limit's something crazy high with MySQL by default for the number of databases, but we haven't hit 20 or 100,000 clients, so I don't know that off by heart. But the nice part is if they're small data. You could easily put that across multiple database servers that are small size database servers, 2-4 gig servers, if there was some type of issue with MySQL switching between all of those databases. So, any others? All right. Oh, one more.
Question. We've had a lot of issues with migrating sub-schemas using Laracon's schema. Did you have that?
Can you tell me what you meant by sub-schemas?
So when you do stuff like if schema has tables, stuff like that, in case you have breaking changes.
Yeah, I would make sure for your migrations, I kind of follow the philosophy of they go up but not down, and you always write kind of an up migration to do things. So we rarely ever go down and, for instance, remove a table. The only case I would see that for the setup that I've done is if one fails and you need to run it again. So I haven't run into many issues like that, but I know what you're talking about. I don't think it would be too big of an issue as long as you did the proper checks around it. And for instance, running that tenant migrate all command, the ones that don't have anything to run would just skip right by, and it would go to the ones that actually needed migrated. So there's been cases where we've had an error in the migration, and it stops the process, and we just restart it, and it usually works without problem. Unless, for instance, it's MySQL gets in a bad state where it has it added a field but didn't add the index, and then you have to re-add that. Yeah, so in those cases, those are usually the exception, not the rule. So you usually just jump in there and kind of fix it manually, and then run the migration command again. And it's there's really no good answer. It really just depends on the situation. So I think I'm out of one if it's quick.
If you had zero downtime deployments like the Dawn
Right.
and you made a code change and had a migration, you had like say 100,000 databases, would that cause a problem again? People run the new code, the database migrations would take a long time to run so that things wouldn't be caught up.
So the question is, if you're using zero downtime deployment and you had like an influx of users all at once.
Well, no, just if you had some migrations that ran in a deployment, so that the database migrations would take a long time.
Yeah. So that's what I was getting at, where if you know that the migrations are going to take a while to run, I would suggest either doing that in parallel or doing kind of that clustered mentality where you run, split your customers into 10% groups, and that we run 10 migrations at once basically and loop through. There's some other things you can do, like the application that I've been working on has been going since Laravel 4.0 alpha. So we have hundreds of migrations. So what we tend to do is every 6 months or so, we actually take a snapshot of that, and we run the snapshot as a SQL file beforehand for a migration. So you end up running basically the snapshot and then whatever migrations have happened since the snapshot, and it seems to be much quicker in that regard. So I think that's it. So thank you guys, and